Hey there, my name is Jonathan Friedman, and you are listening to the 5 FAQs podcast by EHN Canada. This is the show where we scour the internet for the most frequently asked questions about mental health and addiction and ask an expert for their answers to them. Today it is my honor and my distinct pleasure to introduce you to my special guest, Dr. Tatijana Busic. Dr. Busic is a licensed organizational and clinical psychologist with nearly 2 decades of experience. She has dedicated her career to enhancing resilience and emotional intelligence in individuals, both personally and professionally. Her organizational work focuses on developing values-driven and purpose-driven cultures by transforming leadership from the inside out. Dr. Busic also provides trauma-informed psychological services to individuals, with a mission to help people heal and thrive throughout difficult experiences. Her life's mission is to cultivate greater well-being in our world, empowering people to inspire change in themselves, their relationships, careers, and organizations. She holds a PhD in applied psychology and human development from the University of Toronto, has been featured in several media outlets, including the Harvard Business Review and CBC. Dr. Busic, Tatijana, welcome to the show. How are you doing today?
Hi, Jonathan. I'm great. I'm really excited to have a good conversation with you today about some pretty important stuff.
Heck yeah. I'm really excited to have the conversation with you as well. But before we get into the 5 big questions, I'd love for you to tell the listeners, tell us, why'd you get into this field? Why'd you get into this space?
Well, I think that psychology, regardless of who you are, regardless of any individual differences that exist, whether gender, sex, religion, race, cultural background, if we identify as a Homo sapien, we have a psychology. So there is something incredibly powerful about a psychological lens, whether we're engineers or we're therapists or addiction treatment facilities like EHN, teachers, educators. Psychology is such a powerful framework that can really be integrated across multiple disciplines. So from an intellectual perspective, I was very much driven to understanding psychology and developing the skills as a psychologist. And from a personal perspective, I just find human behavior fascinating. And especially around how we navigate, complex scenarios and situations, including stress and trauma, and not just survival, but how we also, survive, heal, and eventually, the idea is to thrive through the various struggles that come our way. So those are some of the things that I love about my profession.
I love that. That's very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And Tatijana, I want to know if you're ready to dive into the internet's biggest questions on leadership and mental health.
Yes, let's do it.
Let's do it. So the first question, the number one most asked question on the internet about leaders and mental health is, why do leaders seek control? How does control affect leadership? Is that why leaders become leaders?
Well, it's interesting. It's a good question. Control from, kind of see it from 2 perspectives, 2 angles. We have control from a psychological angle. So we all have capabilities, various tools, whether they're behavioral tools or mental tools to help us navigate through a tremendous amount of data coming our way. The human brain can be considered as a information processing system, or some people refer to it as a type of machinery. And every single second, the human brain processes something between 60 to 80 million bits of information per second. And a large majority, again, there's some debate around this, but 70-ish% is instinctual and emotional outside of our awareness. So if we didn't have control measures in place to navigate this, the brain would be quite literally overwhelmed. In fact, we likely would not have survived as a species. So control also has adaptive and important regulatory importance. Now, I think when I think of control from a psychological perspective, it's on a continuum. There's 2 opposite extremes on that continuum. One is over control or absolute rigidity, and one is no control and complete overwhelm. We want to navigate ourselves, hopefully not on either end of those 2 extremes, but over various experiences, the lifetime, we're going to navigate somewhere on that continuum. but it's about adaptively using control to help us work through a tremendous amount of data in, being alive and being a human. So there's a balance there. That's from a psychological perspective. From a business or organizational perspective, I think that leaders are sort of analogous to a conductor in an orchestra. You have an orchestra, you have all these different systems and parts to the orchestra, and the leader does have some authority as part of their role and their responsibility to navigate that orchestra. Otherwise, the orchestra is maybe going to sound not so nice, not so harmonious, maybe even a little chaotic.
Maybe people won't be in time with each other.
Exactly. And so in the leadership space, there is an inherent amount of control as part of the responsibility of good leadership in navigation. Does that make sense? This kind of psychological and business kind of?
Totally. I'd love to dive a little bit into just off of that. What is the process of understanding that control? Sure, it sounds like it's important that there's this balance between, maybe that sort of laissez-faire versus having sort of that extreme authority and knowing, when it's important to get your orchestra, keeping on to a certain tempo, and when it's important to let us, maybe a soloist do their thing. But how does that type of control, how does it affect a leader's teams? How does it affect their families? Where does a leader start to understand themselves in context to and in relationship to other people, and what kind of control they want to have?
Yeah. Well, I guess maybe I'm thinking out loud with you right now.
Please.
But maybe if we check in on what is the intention and purpose of that control measure. So if I, for example, have experienced certain types of life events where I have had to exercise an extreme amount of control to keep myself safe, to protect myself, to ensure, that I'm able to do things adaptively and safely, I may have I might show up as a leader where that is my predominant go-to. So if I'm exercising control as a leader based on my own personal sort of fears or maybe triggers or even sort of perceived, whether it's actual or perceived threat, but I've got a strong association to something feels threatening in that. And if I'm controlling from that place, that could have some significant negative impact on the team around me because it's about me and my own fear or difficulty tolerating certain types of stress or certain types of ambiguity. And the way that might show up to others is that I don't trust you to do a good job. And that doesn't feel so good to people and teams around us and can erode, trust over the longer term, team engagement, impact culture, all kinds of other things. I think about, human beings are biologically, we've got a certain innate kind of drives. Two that come to mind around control and autonomy and togetherness and connection is, first, we are all individuals. So as much as you and I are the same as human beings, we have very similar, same brains, physiological systems. We're also completely different from each other. And that's the individuality of, my own autonomy, individuality, and my need for self-expression. But at the same time, I also have a drive for connection, for collaboration. So as leaders, kind of thinking about when you're exercising control, are you respecting the autonomy and the individuality of the person? And also the need for collaboration and connection as a team. We're here to do a job. So those are some of the things that come to my mind.
It sounds like it's possible that as a maybe as a new leader, you're starting to experience okay, cool, I'm getting into that project management-y type of role. And, I really want to, be strong and be directive. But sometimes when I do that, and depending in the ways in which I do that and in which the ways I want to have that control, I could actually be not respecting the autonomy of my team, perhaps, or not taking the time to build that trust. It's another way where it's that balance is really important. It's understanding our own need for control and where that's coming from against, respecting that other people need to have control of themselves and their environments as well.
Yeah, and sometimes I hear leaders say stuff like, well, if I don't manage them, if I don't control this, then people are lazy, their motivation's going to dwindle, things like that. That's an inaccurate, it's a false perception. Most people don't want to lie down on the couch and do nothing.
Right.
We all have drives. We're always motivated for something. Without motivation, again, we wouldn't be existing. It's like time's up in your lifetime. So people aren't inherently lazy. We are inherently driven to express our agency or functioning. We want to do stuff. It's about working with the individual and your team adaptively. But micromanagement and control does not ensure that people are going to do their job. In fact, it has the opposite effect in many, many cases.
I think that's a good segue into our second question, which is, and I think I can already get a sense of what the answer is, but in what ways do you believe personal experiences shape a leader's approach to their role, shape that need for control perhaps, and how this can influence their effectiveness, influence their teams? What are your thoughts?
Well, human beings are social by design. And so from birth until death, our experience, all of our experience shapes us, and it's continually shaping us. So the way in which we perceive ourselves, the way in which models in which we view others, how we see broader systems in the world around us, what biases, we're all born with a lot of different biases that are biologically based and have evolved throughout evolution, but then dependent on experience, we may have exercised more biases than others. So I think that experience shapes everything. And if there's so much learning through experience, so what's learned, what I love about, psychological agility is whatever's learned, you can also unlearn, which is pretty cool. But it is really important, I think, to pay attention to honing our self-awareness so that the question isn't what biases am I perceiving others or the world from, or what beliefs, I'm sorry, if I can go back, not if I am, the question is which ones am I engaging in? So that we can navigate ourselves and make decisions and choose behaviors and ways of being in our organizations that is grounded in the present and what it is that the job actually is requiring from us. Otherwise, we're kind of subconsciously, outside of our awareness, guided by all of these different frameworks that have evolved over our lived experience. So I think it's huge, very huge.
So it sounds like it's really important as a leader or anybody on the team that you really got to be aware of what you're coming to the table with, like how you're, the way you might have approached something, or maybe the way you might have been approached about something in the past, and how that affects how you behave now as yourself around people, around your teams, maybe even around your families too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's not about being like perfect and having some kind of 100% mental health thing here.
The perfect score.
Yeah, it doesn't work that way. But it's about how do you develop the capabilities as a leader, or if, we're looking at a family, maybe as a parent or a caregiver running a home, how do you develop the capability to work with yourself and your own biases, your own models, your own beliefs, your own fears, your own everything adaptively? And so even if you do fumble and make a mistake, which you will, and which we all do on a regular, every single day basis, I think the impact that it has on our team isn't the mistake itself. It's how we handle ourselves when we fumble around to make a mistake, don't know something, or, even make serious mistakes. How you handle that and take ownership and accountability, and then how you communicate that with others determines the impact of that.
I remember a while ago, and I forget if it was in my own, like, going to therapy or where exactly I heard this, but I remember somebody telling me when people are anxious or struggling to think, the first thing that they do is seek where they can control their environments around them. And I think like in my own personal development as a leader, like, this is my first corporate job. Like I'm feeling it out. I get to work with a really awesome team. Like when I am fumbling about, am I then going to other people on my team and saying, hey, like nothing is working, so you need to do this and you need to do this? Or am I saying, hey, like, you know what, we made a mistake today and I want to brainstorm, how do we do this in a better way next time? How do we fix it now? And kind of go there.
That's right. So it's not so much a question of not derailing. The question is being aware of your derailers and how you behave, what your go-tos are when you are especially stressed, and then working with those.
So moving on to our next question, our third question, how do you see the interplay between cognition, physiology, emotion, and behavior affecting leaders in their day-to-day decision-making? I think like for me, when I'm scrolling on TikTok or scrolling on Instagram, and I feel like a lot of people are, talking about like this is how we should be thinking. This is how we should be behaving. This is how we should take care of our emotion. But we know like it's a lot more holistic to that. There's a lot of interplay there.
Absolutely. And in some ways, that whole, these are the 5 steps and do this and you're going to be happy is like in some way a way of coping with the tremendous task of understanding, the complexity of your internal system. So it's like, oh, if I follow these things, it gives you a little bit of relief because then, okay, I'm on the right track, but it's not the sustainable, longer term, deeper kind of well-being work or foundation work. So when it comes to the interplay of what you mentioned, I think of, the individual as system one. So before I come out and work with you, my team member, my colleague, I need to focus my attention on how am I working within my own internal system. So as a psychologist, when I'm doing like leadership assessments or personality assessments, things like that, I'm always looking for what's going on in the person's cognition. We have these things called thoughts, stories, and we are designed to be observers of those thoughts. How is this individual observing and relating to the thoughts that they're having? Then we look at the second part of this system, which is the emotional world. And we have something like, 80 or 90 different emotions that we're designed to experience on an every single second basis. How are we experiencing the emotions that we're experiencers of emotions? So what's your relationship to how you handle yourself when you're afraid, anxious, embarrassed, etc.? I look at physiology. So there's cognition, emotion. How is my body interacting with those thoughts, experiencing those thoughts and those emotions? How do we regulate? How do we work with our own physiological systems? And then there's behavior. What's the behavioral response to these, 3 things? So those are the 4 components of kind of a whole human being. But it's really important to also have the social, contextual kind of setting. No one is completely functioning in isolation.
Nobody lives in a vacuum.
No, there's always a political, social, environmental, all kinds of different elements to the context around us. So how is that individual interacting with the system of systems around them in the context? And so we want to gather a few data points, some of the strengths, and then what are some of the areas that need some attention.
So it's interesting because I think like behavior is always that thing that we see and that we all interact with, but really there's a really complex interplay between how all of these things work together and all of the different things and contexts that people live in within that team, but also individually, like somebody coming into work at 9 a.m. or, maybe they're coming in late, somebody on your team. They're like, hey, like, we don't want you to come in late. That's the behavior. But, really, we don't know if they had a fight with their spouse in the morning or all of the other different pieces. And taking time to just focus on that behavior in isolation, it doesn't really give the full context.
No. And I think that we're also this is broadly speaking now, very generalization here, but we're kind of in an era of a lot of judgment. Oh, they're late, they're lazy. Oh, they're late, they don't care. Oh, they're late, they're not hardworking. So you're judging this entire human being based on this tiny snippet of thing that you're observing, which when I think about that is like, it's so irrational. But when we're judging, we feel so like smart and strong and rational. It's like, I know who you are behind that behavior.
Yeah.
But if you really stop to think, well, how could you? You don't. It's just not possible. So a little bit of humility, self-awareness, and a little bit of humility and catching ourselves, kind of making snap judgments like that, I think is really important.
Love that. I think that's a really great segue to our next question, which is, like, we're talking a lot about behavior, we're talking a lot about emotions. Like, mental health is a really broad topic. How do you define it in the context of leadership? And why is it crucial for leaders to prioritize their own mental well-being? I get a sense that it's important to take care of it so you can, check yourself and have that resilience and be able to notice these things more and more in your day-to-day. But yeah, let's start there.
Well, I think that historically, again, broadly speaking here, mental health has been associated with illness and mental illness. And while mental health issues and illness and diagnoses are certainly a part of mental health, there's a whole vast world here in terms with respect to how you learn, your learning styles and preferences, how your brain is neurologically kind of wired to perceive and function. Mental health is about absolutely every single component and aspect of your life. And so when I hear sometimes leaders say stuff like, well, I'm a rational leader. We don't need to, focus on mental health or emotion here. Essentially, you're dismissing something like, you're dismissing a very large component of data in how your team and yourself are functioning. So it's like saying, okay, I'm just going to ignore 80 or 90% of the data right here when I'm making these decisions by over focusing on rationality. So mental health, I think, is foundational for sustainable leadership, and understanding kind of clearly that it's about decision making. It's about a whole bunch of different cognitive processes. It's about how do you innovate? How do you tap into your creative centers? How do you understand and manage ambiguity? How do you make sense of information? How do you connect the dots? In addition to all the other stuff around how do you work with sadness and fear and emotion and everything else. And so really kind of demystifying a little bit this concept, bringing it down to earth for what it like really is, and debunking some inaccurate perceptions around mental health and, mental or psychological functioning.
I think
Go ahead.
I think it's really interesting because I think of myself, and I'll only use myself as an example. When I am in that heightened state, like I really struggle with anxiety. And when I'm in that heightened state, my ability to make strong decisions, it could be, a fluke that I make a good decision. But when I'm in that heightened state, like it often brings me to a worse decision than if I would have had the time, the space to think it out. When I'm taking care of myself, when I'm, going to therapy all the time, when I'm working out, when I'm taking the time to do the things that fulfill me creatively, like guitar and all of those other things, it gives me the time and space to actually be more functional as a leader or as a partner or so on and so forth.
Yeah. And all the activities that you just described, that's under the umbrella sometimes of self-care. And I get a little bit on the self-care movement too, where I'm like, it's not simple, like just have a bubble bath and get yourself a nice robe from the bookstore. Self-care is around understanding how to regenerate and replenish your internal system.
Love that.
And so if we are functioning and working in ways that are taking away, they're degenerating and emptying out our cognitive, emotional, physiological system, spiritual, it's taking out. And so mental health being about, it's not just responsible, it's mature. It's actually being an adult, learning how to replenish and regenerate your internal system so that you can show up not just the way you want for other people, but for yourself, like for you. So I think it's foundational, especially in today's world. We can't ignore it anymore. It's irresponsible to ignore it. And I think that organizations are really coming to, it's a process, but the process has begun. It can no longer be ignored. The facts are kind of on the table. And perhaps the last 3 to 5 years globally have really brought that to surface.
So when organizations are, taking stock in that way, and they're seeing like, okay, we now realize this is something that's really important that we should be bringing to the table. Like, where does a people leader even start to bring that kind of care into their organization? Are they calling up different like therapy clinics? Are they starting to look into like EAPs? Where does an organization start? Is it culture?
Perhaps, I don't know, like it'll depend on context and what's going on in the organization and the sort of, where they're at in terms of things like psychological safety, well-being, and how the people are doing, and how the organization as a whole is functioning. But a good place to start is take a minute and turn your attention inward. How are you doing? So often leaders will come to me and say, I need some help motivating my team. And I'm being a bit silly right now, but I'm like, forget it. You can't motivate anybody else. You've got to begin first by going internally, following the 5 steps or 10 steps of the motivation that you learn in a really great workshop. You'll practice it. Then it's likely going to dwindle. After maybe a few days, a few weeks, you might keep 1 or 2 nuggets. It's not the sustainable type. But when you begin with understanding yourself first and what's going on with you, that sets up the foundation for then being able to implement those 10 steps in a way that has a much broader reach. So we have a lot more autonomy, I think, possibility. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be these massive, large, projects and interventions necessarily. Sometimes, yes, absolutely. Again, lots of different types of services out there for organizations. But a good place to begin is kind of going back to the basics of how am I taking care of myself and communicating within me, and then watch how that translates when you're, delivering some tough feedback or something like that to your team. So that would be, I think, let's think of there's the self and looking at how you are relating to yourself internally and then going outside the self. But again, we do sort of, broadly, generally speaking, live in a world that's very outside focused.
Yep.
Yeah. Does that answer your question? Was that?
Yeah. You crushed it.
Yeah. Okay.
Awesome. So looking ahead, what do you envision as the future of like mental health and leadership? What are the trends? Where are things going? Maybe where would you like for things to be going?
Well, according to, institutions as big as the World Economic Forum, emotional intelligence by next year is the top most sought after skill in leadership, period. And so I think that we need to really kind of accept that these are not the soft skills. They have never been the soft skills. They have always and are the hard skills and the power skills of how to lead in a way that will help you navigate 21st century complexity. And it is a complex world. It's not the first time we've been through some complexity. That's for sure. Change, transformation, suffering, all this stuff has been going on from the beginning of time. But there is something different about this period of time in terms of the speed of data coming at us. That has shifted tremendously in a matter of 20 years. And so EQ, emotional intelligence, capability. Again, it's not about being emotional or sitting around in circles and talking about feelings with people all day long. No, these are hard tools and capabilities that need to be exercised and brought into the fabric of organizational culture and models of communication. That's what I would like to see. So even 10 years ago when I started as doing my PhD, I'd mentioned the word psychology in organizations and no, management, HR, do not talk therapy. And now I'm like, nope. Now everybody is really those conversations are happening. And my hope is that we continue to go in that direction, because that as a foundation can help us with all of the other issues and complex scenarios that we're facing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, that brings us to the end of the 5 big questions. And it was really, really amazing and a pleasure and really exciting to hear your thoughts on mental health and leadership. Where can people find you? Where can people get to know you a little bit more? I know before the show we were talking a bit about your new website, which is upcoming, which is really exciting. Tell people where they can find you.
At TatijanaBusic.com. The name of my practice is Busic Psychology and Consulting. And something that we do that's a little bit different than some other practices, whether they're therapy practices or consulting firms, is we provide a hybrid approach. So we work on professional and leadership issues that individuals are facing, as well as the personal. There's no division in our work. And this is a part of the holistic kind of view. So TatijanaBusic.com, that's where you can find me, or LinkedIn. And I love talking to people. So when people reach out to me with a question or things like that, I do my best to, respond. And I really enjoy connecting with people all over the world.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming onto the show. Just to leave the listeners with a little bit about us as well. Recovery is possible, and EHN Canada is the place for both virtual and inpatient treatment programs for mental health and addiction. To learn more about EHN Canada and how you can begin your own recovery journey, please go to ehn.ca. To listen to even more episodes of the 5 Facts podcast, you can check it out on your favorite streaming platform. Tatijana, thank you so much, and we will see you next time.